Well, I don't think we should be concerned that a deal won't be achieved. Ebrahim Raisi, the new Iranian president, in the same press conference, indicated his support for the deal and mentioned that the deal is being pursued as a consensus position from the Iranian security establishment. But his comments about meeting President Biden potentially in the future do indicate that there will be a change to the trajectory of diplomacy more generally. Western governments had hoped that the nuclear deal being restored would be a stepping stone to wider negotiations with Iran. I think this is a clear indication that the Raisi government is not going to be inclined to taking those diplomatic steps further than the nuclear deal itself.
So what does this mean? We know he's probably the most hardline president that has been elected in recent times. What does this mean for Iran's future and the future of negotiations, not just with the US, but more broadly across the region?
Well, if we're going to try and be optimistic, Iran's foreign policy has always been characterized by a strain of pragmatism. And that pragmatism is the result of the consensus that needs to be formed between different bodies in the security establishment in Iran around key foreign policy decisions. So, for example, whether or not Iran negotiates is not simply the prerogative of the president. There are other bodies, such as the Supreme National Security Council, that will certainly weigh in on the nature of Iranian foreign policy moving forward. And so we might expect that that will soften a little bit some of the edges around the foreign policy that Raisi may personally believe in. But what I think it does mean is that Iran will be at an interesting juncture. The restoration of the nuclear deal was supposed to be Iran's re-entry back into the international community after several years of having been forcibly isolated by the Trump administration. But if Raisi is not personally interested in ending that isolation, or if he himself, because of aspects of his personal history as a leader in Iran and perhaps his involvement in human rights violations, those factors might actually mean that Iran remains more isolated than we had envisioned at this stage.
Yes, because he's been accused of having blood on his hands, has been one of the most extreme presidents. So is his past more of a stumbling block than anything else? And then also looking at internally the expectations of the Iranians themselves to be accepted as part of the broader communities.
I think it potentially is a stumbling block. Senior officials in the Biden administration have already started to signal that who is in office in Iran is not as important for them as the strategic logic of using diplomacy to deal with difficult points of tension. But at the same time, there will be many in Europe and in the US who question whether or not diplomacy is sensible or appealing if we're dealing with a government in Iran that has these kinds of difficult characteristics. So ultimately, I think it's something that the Raisi administration will need to grapple with. Are they going to try and find a way to make themselves more palatable as a negotiating party to Western governments, both in the context of the nuclear deal and also what might have followed if negotiations were to be pursued on a broader set of issues?
And where does it leave Israel? They're, of course, mightily concerned by his election, and they are very concerned about the US returning to the nuclear deal. Where's Israel positioned now?
Well, we have a new prime minister in Israel, and Prime Minister Bennett has made public comments that make clear his concerns about the diplomacy that's taking place between particularly the US and Iran indirectly at the moment. Some of that I think we can chalk up to the need for him to show that he is also going to be tough in Iran, sort of carrying on the mantle of Netanyahu. But at the same time, I think that there is probably a realization in the security establishment in Israel that the restoration of the nuclear deal is in Israel's national interest. It brings Iran's nuclear program under strict monitoring, and it creates a certain set of conditions where maybe there will be less risk of escalation between Israel and Iran moving forward. That being said, again, I think there will be a challenge in trying to find a better modus vivendi between Iran and Israel in the region, given the outcome of the Iranian election.
Yeah, and I mean, we saw again the nuclear power plant facing an emergency shutdown. There have been a series of issues for Iran around security. Do you think this is an indication that the ongoing sanctions are really compromising Iran and the security of the country?
I think that's the most likely explanation, that a lot of critical infrastructure in the country is suffering safety lapses because Iran has faced difficulties for a long time in getting key equipment and technology necessary to upgrade that infrastructure. But at the same time, I think for members of the Iranian public looking at the spate of incidents, whether it's in fires at an oil refinery, explosions at enrichment facilities, now a shutdown of the nuclear power plant, whether it's a safety lapse or a security lapse, it's very concerning and points to questions about capacity of the government to manage this infrastructure. So one thing we would be hoping for is that, let's say, the restoration of the nuclear deal, if it makes it a bit easier to get some of that equipment and technology in, we should see some of these incidents subside. I think that's what the hopes will be for members of the Iranian public.
Indeed. Nice to talk, Esfandyar. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.